Wait. A freezing 5-year-old girl stopped a millionaire at a bus stop, and changed his life forever. The wind cut sharply through the bus stop, carrying the smell of snow and exhaust, rattling the thin metal bench as cars rushed past without slowing down. Streetlights flickered above the empty road, casting pale circles of light onto the frozen pavement. It was late, the kind of late when the city feels indifferent, when people hurry home and stop noticing what they pass along the way. A black car rolled to a stop near the curb. The engine hummed quietly as the driver stepped out, already pulling his coat tighter around himself. He moved with confidence and purpose, the posture of a man who knew exactly where he was going and how much his time was worth. His dark hair was neatly styled, his blue eyes sharp and focused, and his tailored coat spoke of wealth without needing explanation. His name was Richard Mason, and he was used to leaving places behind without hesitation. He opened the car door, ready to get in, when a voice reached him. Wait. It was barely more than a breath, fragile and unsure, almost swallowed by the wind. Richard paused, his hand still on the door, irritation flickering briefly across his face before something deeper replaced it. He turned slowly, scanning the bus stop. That was when he saw her. She was sitting directly on the cold concrete, not on the bench, as if she had not known she was allowed to use it. A small girl, no more than 5 years old, with pale blonde hair tangled by the wind and large blue eyes dulled by exhaustion. She wore a thin red dress that clung to her legs, offering no protection from the freezing air. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her shoulders trembling uncontrollably, her lips slightly blue. She looked up at him as if summoning the last of her strength. "Please," she whispered again, quieter this time. "Wait." Richard felt a strange tightening in his chest, an unfamiliar hesitation. He glanced down the road, half expecting an adult to appear, someone calling her name, someone responsible. No one came. The road remained empty, the cars passing by without slowing. He closed the car door slowly and walked toward her, his shoes crunching softly on the frost-covered pavement. As he crouched in front of her, he noticed how unnaturally still she was trying to be, as if movement itself required too much effort. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, though the question already felt wrong the moment it left his mouth. The girl blinked slowly, as if focusing was difficult. "Mom told me to wait here," she said. "She said she'd be back." Her voice held no anger, no fear, only quiet acceptance, and that frightened him more than panic would have. He looked at her small hands, red and stiff from the cold, and realized how long she must have been sitting there. Something inside Richard shifted, subtle but irreversible. He took off his coat without thinking and carefully wrapped it around her shoulders, shielding her from the wind. The girl flinched at first, then relaxed slightly, leaning into the warmth. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophie," she answered. The bus stop remained silent except for the distant rush of traffic, but in that moment Richard understood something with unsettling clarity. He had planned to leave, just like he always did, but this time the road ahead no longer mattered. Whatever he had been rushing toward could wait. Richard stayed crouched in front of Sophie for a long moment, studying her small face in the harsh light of the street lamp. Her eyelashes were dusted with tiny crystals of ice, and every breath she took came out as a faint, uneven cloud. He had seen fear before in boardrooms and negotiations, but this was different. This was the quiet kind of fear that comes from being abandoned too many times to protest anymore. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked softly. Sophie shrugged, the movement weak and slow. "I don't know," she said. "It was lighter when Mom left." The answer sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He glanced at his watch and felt a wave of disbelief. Hours had passed since dusk. He imagined the cold seeping steadily into her small body while the world continued on without noticing. "Why did she leave you here?" he asked, careful not to sound accusing. Sophie looked down at her knees, picking at a loose thread on her dress. "She said she needed to get something," she replied. "She said I should be a good girl and wait." Richard nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. He had heard many excuses in his life, but none that felt so heavy. He reached out instinctively and took her hands in his. They were painfully cold, almost numb. "That's very cold," he murmured. "You shouldn't be sitting here like this." She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her body responding to warmth without hesitation. "I tried to go inside the store," she said quietly. "But the man told me to leave." Anger flared in Richard's chest, sharp and immediate. He swallowed it back, focusing on the child in front of him instead of the world that had failed her. "Do you have anyone else?" he asked. "A grandma? An aunt? Anyone you can call?" Sophie shook her head. "No. It's just me and Mom." The simplicity of the statement made it even more devastating. Richard stood slowly, lifting Sophie carefully into his arms before she could protest. She weighed almost nothing, light and fragile, and he realized with a jolt how little strength she must have left. She tensed for a second, startled, then relaxed when she felt his coat wrapped securely around her. "Are you taking me away?" she asked, not frightened, just curious. "I'm taking you somewhere warm," he answered. "And safe." He carried her to his car and placed her gently in the back seat, turning on the heat immediately. As warm air filled the vehicle, Sophie let out a small, shaky breath and leaned her head against the seat, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before she forced them open again. "You can sleep," Richard said. "I won't go anywhere." She studied him carefully, as if trying to decide whether the promise was real. After a long pause, she nodded. Outside, the bus stop stood empty again, silent and forgotten. Richard started the engine, aware that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Whatever waited for him at his destination no longer mattered. What mattered was the small girl in his back seat, trusting him with her safety in a world that had already taught her how easily people disappear. The heater hummed softly as the car moved through nearly empty streets, streetlights sliding past the windows like slow, tired stars. Sophie sat curled into the seat, wrapped in Richard's coat, her small hands tucked beneath the fabric as if afraid the warmth might disappear if she let go of it. She watched the road in silence, her eyes heavy but alert, fighting sleep with the stubbornness of a child who had learned that closing her eyes could be risky. Richard drove carefully, his mind racing far faster than the car. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, checking on her, making sure her eyes were still open, that her breathing remained steady. The reality of what he had done began to settle in. He had taken a child from a bus stop in the middle of the night. Any other day, any other story, that thought alone would have stopped him. But tonight, leaving her there had never truly been an option. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked quietly, breaking the silence. "To a hospital," Richard replied. "Just to make sure you're okay." She nodded, as if that answer made sense. "Hospitals are warm," she said. "I like the warm." Richard felt a tightness in his chest at the simplicity of it. "Do you feel sick?" he asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "I'm tired," she said. "And my legs hurt. But that's normal." Normal. The word echoed uncomfortably in his mind. He wondered what her idea of normal looked like, how many nights like this one she had already endured. He slowed slightly as they approached a red light, then asked the question that had been pressing against him since he first saw her. "You said your mom left you there," he began carefully. Does she do that often? Sophie didn't answer right away. She traced a small circle on the fogged window with her finger, watching it disappear almost as soon as it formed. Sometimes, she said at last. When she drinks, she gets sleepy or angry. She tells me to wait so I don't make her mad. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the leather creaking faintly under his hands. How long does she usually leave you? I don't know, Sophie replied. Until it's quiet again. He didn't ask what quiet meant. He was afraid he already knew. The hospital came into view, its bright lights cutting through the darkness. Richard parked near the entrance and hurried around to the back seat, lifting Sophie gently into his arms again. This time she didn't tense at all. She rested her head against his shoulder, her body heavy with exhaustion. Inside, nurses moved quickly, their expressions shifting the moment they saw the child in his arms. Questions followed, calm but urgent. Richard answered what he could, admitting what he didn't know, refusing to let go of Sophie's hand as they examined her. She watched everything with quiet seriousness, flinching only once when a thermometer touched her skin. She's been exposed to the cold for too long, a nurse said. She's lucky you brought her in. Richard swallowed. Lucky wasn't the word he would have chosen. While they waited, Sophie sat beside him on a narrow bed, her feet dangling. She leaned closer to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. You didn't have to stop, she said suddenly, her voice soft but steady. Most people don't. Richard looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she spoke without bitterness, without expectation. I did have to, he said. I just didn't know it until I heard you. Sophie considered that, then gave a small nod, as if accepting it as fact. Her eyes finally closed, her body relaxing for the first time that night. Richard stayed where he was, watching her sleep, understanding with unsettling clarity that this moment was not a detour in his life. It was the beginning of something that would demand far more than his time or money. It would demand that he stay. The hospital room was dim and quiet, lit only by a small lamp near the bed and the soft glow of monitors that measured things Sophie was too young to understand. She slept under a thin blanket, her face finally relaxed, her breathing slow and even. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, though her hands still looked small and fragile against the white sheets. Richard sat in a chair beside the bed, his coat folded neatly over his arm, feeling the weight of the night settle into his bones. Now that the urgency had passed, exhaustion crept in, but his mind refused to rest. Every few minutes, he looked at Sophie to make sure she was still there, that this wasn't some strange illusion created by guilt or cold air and loneliness. A doctor entered quietly and closed the door behind her. She spoke in a low voice, careful not to wake the child. She has mild hypothermia and signs of prolonged neglect, she said plainly. Physically, she'll recover. Emotionally is harder to predict. Richard nodded, his jaw tight. What happens now? We've contacted social services, the doctor replied. They'll need to locate the mother and assess the situation. You did the right thing bringing her in. The words should have reassured him, but instead they stirred unease. The idea of Sophie being returned to the bus stop, or to a home that could produce a night like this, made his stomach twist. Can I stay with her? He asked. The doctor studied him for a moment, then nodded. For now. Hours passed slowly. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, unaware of the small life being quietly evaluated behind hospital walls. Sophie stirred once, murmuring something unintelligible, and Richard leaned forward instinctively, placing a careful hand near hers without touching, as if afraid to wake her. Just before dawn, voices sounded in the hallway. Two people entered the room, their expressions professional and alert. A woman with a clipboard introduced herself from Child Protective Services, followed by a police officer who stood near the door. Richard rose from his chair. "I'm the one who brought her in," he said. The woman nodded. "We've located the mother," she said. "She was found intoxicated at a nearby bar." She confirmed leaving the child at the bus stop. The officer added quietly, "She didn't report her missing." The words landed heavily. Richard looked at Sophie, still asleep, unaware that the world was making decisions about her future without her knowledge. "She can't go back to her," Richard said before he could stop himself. The social worker met his gaze, her tone calm but firm. "That will be determined by the courts. For now, the child will be placed in temporary care." Sophie chose that moment to wake up. Her eyes opened slowly, confused, then focused on the unfamiliar faces. Panic flickered across her expression, and she reached out blindly. Richard was there instantly. He took her hand, holding it gently but securely. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't cry. "Are they going to take me away?" she asked. The room went very still. Richard looked at the social worker, then back at the little girl whose trust he had earned in the cold. He took a steady breath. "No," he said. "Not alone." The social worker raised an eyebrow slightly. "Mr. Mason," she said carefully, "are you offering to take responsibility?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Yes. Whatever that means." Sophie squeezed his hand, her fingers still weak but determined. She leaned toward him, resting her head against his arm as if the decision had already been made in her heart. As the first pale light of morning crept through the window, Richard understood something with startling clarity. Stopping at that bus stop had not been an act of kindness alone. It had been a choice. And now, every step forward would be one he would take with her. The days that followed unfolded in a blur of paperwork, waiting rooms, and careful conversations spoken in lowered voices. Sophie remained in the hospital longer than expected, not because her body needed it, but because the doctors wanted to be certain she would not be sent back into the cold too quickly. Richard visited every morning and stayed until late at night, sitting beside her bed, reading from whatever children's book he could find in the hospital gift shop, even though she often fell asleep halfway through. Social services returned more than once. They asked Sophie gentle questions, repeating them in different ways, checking for consistency, for signs of confusion or coaching. Sophie answered honestly, without embellishment. She spoke of waiting at bus stops, of counting cars, of learning when to be quiet so her mother wouldn't yell. Each word tightened something inside Richard that he had not known could still ache. Her mother was brought in for questioning and then released. She never came to the hospital. She never asked to see her daughter. When Richard was told this, he felt a mix of anger and an unexpected, heavy sadness. He had built his life believing neglect was always dramatic, loud, obvious. Seeing it reduced to indifference was far worse. One afternoon, while Sophie colored quietly at a small table in the corner of the room, a social worker sat across from Richard with a file open between them. "She will be placed in temporary foster care," the woman explained. "Unless a suitable guardian steps forward." Richard did not look at the file. He looked at Sophie instead, at the way she carefully filled in the lines of a drawing, choosing colors slowly, deliberately. "What qualifies as suitable?" he asked. The social worker studied him. "Stability. Commitment. Time. And the willingness to be evaluated." "I have all of that," Richard said. The word surprised even him. He had never measured his life in those terms before. Yet as he said them, he knew they were true. His wealth had given him comfort and control, but this was the first time it offered something else, the ability to protect someone who had no one. That evening, Sophie climbed onto the hospital bed and patted the space beside her, a silent invitation. Richard hesitated only a moment before sitting. She leaned against him, light and careful, as if still unsure how much space she was allowed to take. "Are they mad at my mom?" she asked suddenly. Richard considered his answer. "They're worried about you," he said. "That's what matters right now." Sophie nodded, absorbing this. "Will I have to wait outside again?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Richard said firmly. "You won't." She looked up at him then, her blue eyes searching his face for cracks, for uncertainty. Finding none, she rested her head against his arm and closed her eyes. Late that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Richard stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. He realized that his life had always been about movement, about getting somewhere else, about never staying too long. Now, for the first time, staying felt not like a risk, but like the only decision that made sense. He didn't know what the next weeks would bring. Court hearings, inspections, doubts, and fear were all waiting ahead. But as he looked back at the small girl sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knew how long, Richard understood something with absolute certainty. He was no longer passing through her life. He was choosing it. The decision did not bring instant relief. Instead, it opened the door to a different kind of weight, one that followed Richard out of the hospital and into every quiet moment that came after. Sophie was discharged 2 days later, wrapped in borrowed clothes and holding a small plastic bag with the few things that were officially hers. She stayed close to him as they walked through the hospital corridors, her fingers brushing his coat as if needing to confirm that he was still there. For now, she was placed under temporary protective supervision, which meant she could not simply go home with him. A foster placement was being arranged, and the word sounded clinical and distant, stripping warmth from the idea of safety. Richard listened as the social worker explained the next steps, the evaluations, the timelines that could stretch for months. He nodded, asked the right questions, and signed where he was told, all while feeling a growing frustration at how slowly the system moved when a child needed certainty now. Sophie listened too, even when the adults thought she wasn't. She sat quietly in a chair, swinging her legs back and forth, absorbing every word with the careful attention of someone who had learned that decisions were often made without her consent. When they finally stepped outside into the pale afternoon light, she looked up at Richard. "So I'm not going with you?" she asked. "Not yet," he replied honestly. "But I'm not going anywhere." She studied his face, then nodded, accepting the answer without protest. That quiet acceptance hurt more than anger ever could. The foster home was temporary and clean, run by a middle-aged couple who tried their best to appear warm and reassuring. Sophie was polite, said thank you when prompted, and followed instructions carefully. Richard stayed longer than necessary, sitting at the kitchen table while she explored the unfamiliar space. When it was time for him to leave, she stood in the doorway, her arms folded tightly against her chest. "You'll come back?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Tomorrow." She didn't smile, but she nodded, as if filing the promise away to be tested later. Richard returned the next day, and the day after that. He brought books, then a small stuffed animal he had chosen after standing too long in a store aisle, unsure what was appropriate. Sophie accepted it quietly, holding it close when she thought no one was watching. Each visit loosened something between them, though she still watched him carefully, waiting for the moment he might fail. Meanwhile, the investigation into her mother's situation concluded quickly and without mercy. The woman was found unconscious in a shelter 3 days later and pronounced dead from alcohol poisoning before morning. When Richard was informed, he felt a complicated mix of anger, sorrow, and grim inevitability. He did not know the woman well, but he knew what her absence would mean for Sophie. He sat with Sophie that evening, choosing his words slowly, deliberately. "Your mom died," he said softly. Sophie did not react at first. She stared at the wall, then at the floor, then finally at him. "So she's not coming back?" she asked. "No," Richard replied. "She's not." Sophie nodded once. She didn't cry. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his arm, staying very still. Richard wrapped an arm around her, holding her gently, understanding that grief did not always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrived as silence. That night, after he left the foster home, Richard sat alone in his car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The situation had changed irrevocably. What had begun as an act of stopping had become a responsibility that no one else could or would take. And for the first time in his life, the idea did not frighten him. It steadied him. Time began to take on a different shape after that. Days were no longer measured by meetings or deadlines, but by visits, phone calls, and the small signs of progress that only appeared when Richard learned to slow down enough to notice them. Sophie remained in the foster home, but the distance between them felt less like separation and more like a bridge under construction, fragile yet intentional. Richard adjusted his life in ways that surprised even himself. He cleared his schedule without explanation, delegated decisions he once guarded fiercely, and learned to leave work while the sun was still up. Every afternoon, he arrived at the foster home at the same time, never early enough to seem desperate and never late enough to risk disappointment. Sophie noticed. She always noticed. At first, she kept her coat on during his visits, as if she might need to leave at any moment. She answered questions politely but briefly, choosing her words with care. Richard did not push. He sat with her at the table, helped her with simple puzzles, listened as she read aloud in a quiet, deliberate voice. When silence came, he let it stay. Little by little, the tests began. Sophie asked the same questions repeatedly, watching his face each time for a change in tone or patience. She asked what time he would leave, whether he would come back tomorrow, what would happen if he didn't. Once, when he arrived a few minutes late because of traffic, she refused to come out of her room. Richard waited without complaint, sitting on the floor outside the door until she opened it herself. "I thought you forgot," she said. "I didn't," he answered simply. "I'm here." That became something like a refrain between them. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just consistent. The evaluations continued. Social workers visited Richard's home, inspected rooms, asked questions about his childhood, his work, his intentions. He answered honestly, even when the truth was imperfect. He admitted that he didn't know everything, that he was learning, that he was afraid of getting it wrong. Instead of weakening his case, the honesty seemed to strengthen it. Sophie was evaluated too. Therapists spoke to her gently, helping her name feelings she had never been allowed to acknowledge. Some days she came out quiet and withdrawn. Other days she was restless, full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Richard learned to recognize the difference and respond without trying to fix everything at once. One evening, as they sat together drawing at the kitchen table of the foster home, Sophie looked up suddenly. "If I come live with you," she said carefully, "will I have to be very quiet?" The question caught him off guard. "No," he replied. "You can be loud. Or sad. Or angry. Or quiet if you want. You don't have to earn your place." She considered this for a long time, then nodded, returning to her drawing. But that night, for the first time, she left her coat on the chair instead of keeping it on her lap. Weeks later, the decision came through. Not with celebration, but with paperwork and careful language. Temporary custody. Supervised transition. A trial period. Richard signed everything with steady hands, aware that nothing was guaranteed yet, but everything was possible. The first night Sophie came to stay with him, she stood in the doorway of his house and did not move. The space was quiet, warm, prepared but not overwhelming. A small bedroom waited down the hall, its light on. "This is your room," Richard said. "You don't have to go in yet." She stepped inside slowly, touching the edge of the bed, the bookshelf, the nightlight. Then she turned back to him. "You'll be here in the morning?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Every morning." She climbed onto the bed, curled under the blanket, and after a long pause, reached out and took his hand. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Richard sat there until her breathing evened out, understanding something he had never grasped before. Being needed was not a burden. It was a responsibility that gave shape to everything else. And for the first time, his life felt not full, but whole. The first months together were quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. Sophie woke early every morning, sitting up in bed and listening carefully, as if waiting for proof that the house was still real. Each time she heard footsteps or the soft clink of dishes in the kitchen, she relaxed just a little more. Routine became their anchor. Breakfast at the same table, walks after school, evenings spent reading or drawing side by side without the pressure to fill every silence. Richard learned quickly that healing did not mean forgetting. Some nights Sophie woke crying, calling for a mother who could no longer answer. Richard never tried to silence those moments. He sat beside her, held her hand, and reminded her that missing someone did not mean losing what had been found. Slowly, the nightmares grew less frequent, replaced by dreams that left her only quiet and thoughtful when she woke. The house changed as well. Crayon drawings appeared on the refrigerator. Small shoes lined up near the door. Laughter found its way into rooms that had once echoed. Richard found himself smiling at the smallest things, like the sound of Sophie humming while she brushed her teeth or the way she insisted on helping with tasks she was still too small to do well. Months passed, then a year. The final custody hearing came and went without drama, the judge's words formal but decisive. Sophie was no longer a temporary presence. She was home. On a cold winter evening, exactly 1 year after the night at the bus stop, they walked past the same place together. The bench was empty, the streetlights unchanged, the wind just as sharp. Sophie stopped and looked at it for a long moment. "This is where you heard me," she said. Richard nodded. "Yes." She took his hand, her grip confident now, not desperate. "Thank you for waiting," she said. Richard felt emotion rise in his chest, warm and steady rather than overwhelming. He knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes at the same level he had that first night. "Thank you for asking me to stop," he replied. They stood there for a moment longer, then continued walking, their shadows stretching together across the pavement. The world had not become kinder overnight, and pain had not vanished from their past. But something else had taken its place. They were no longer passing through each other's lives. They were staying. And that made all the difference.